Hey everybody, my name's Andy, in case you don't know me. I'm really interested in getting clarity on the intellectual dark web discussion, especially around religion. And I'm noticing that there is some squirreliness in some of the language that's being used and that I don't think is really taking advantage of some of the precision we could take advantage of. That's the result of analytic philosophy when we're having these conversations. And when I say these conversations, I mean conversations like the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson debate, even the kind of the Jonathan Pageau videos and his interaction with David Fuller and others. And of course, this reflects something in the wider culture, I think, right now, is I think it's a lack of some categories that would really help us in that kind of integral way incorporate what we want to keep from the religious tradition and what we want to keep from what we've learned from the Enlightenment and put those things together. So I'm going to put forward three different categories, or actually three different distinctions that I think could help us get there. So the first one is, let me just kind of tell you my own, a little bit of my story and how I landed at this term and this distinction. So many of you know I grew up a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, and after I left the faith, I had become convinced there wasn't a God, and I'm going to get to the term God in a minute here. But I'd become convinced there wasn't a God. I described myself as an atheist. Looking back now, I describe myself as a very angry atheist. But what happened for me is I jettisoned this belief in a deity with which I had a personal relationship. And it was interesting for me because as I began to meet other atheists, I began to meet the kinds of people who had never had religious experience in any sort of a meaningful way to them, in a way that they could, they could say, this experience felt transcendent. So an example would be speaking in tongues. I used to speak in tongues. I can still speak in tongues on command. That's another story for another time. But the experience of speaking in tongues for me was a transformative, mystical experience that, oddly enough, was available to me after I left the faith. And it didn't feel inauthentic even for me to speak in tongues after I left the faith, except for when I thought about it. But the actual experience of doing it still yielded this sense of almost of transcending language or something like that, of getting to something below language. And so I really had to ask myself, how is this possible? I don't believe in a God anymore. So the first distinction I want to introduce here is this notion of theological non-cognitivism. It's a $12 word, but what it means is that it's the idea that if you are a theological non-cognitivist, you don't think that talk about theology, talk about God, talk about mystical experiences is really talk about anything at all. So in the same way that you might talk about a married bachelor, which is of course a self-contradiction and can't exist, you might say, yeah, people who have religious experiences, they're more or less talking about absolutely nothing. And so this is the kind of position which, if I were to guess, I would assume that, say, like Richard Dawkins or Even Christopher Hitchens, probably, maybe Daniel Dennett, I'm not sure. I don't think Sam Harris. But many of the kind of now they're classical new atheists, many of that crowd, I think, would adopt this viewpoint. Religion, when they're talking about God, it's all nonsense. That's the view of theological non-cognitivism. And of course, the distinction is theological cognitivism. The idea that when we're talking about God, there is in fact something there to talk about, whether or not we're concerned with the cause of what it is we're talking about or the ontological status of it, whether or not, or how it exists, I should say, or the epistemology of it, how we know that it exists. It's bracketing all of those questions, and it's just saying, yeah, when we're talking about God, there's a real thing there that humans experience, and it's a thing. And so I think what's sometimes missing in the conversations that I see is a clarity here that some people, and what Jordan Peterson has really done, I think, is he has reanimated some of the religious and I would say even mystical tradition, and he's done it in the face of what was a kind of prevailing theological non-cognitivism amongst the, shall we say, the intelligentsia or the literati. And so there was this view amongst the highly educated, I think, that pervaded the culture, that anybody who really believes in God or talks about mystical experiences, we don't really think they actually know what they're talking about. And this is, of course, positivism is really another way of thinking of this same concept. But what Jordan Peterson said is, actually, there's something there. And not only is there something there, it's worth considering. You know, another figure like this is Karen Armstrong. She is a historian of religion, and described herself as an atheist, then came back to it, and she found within the confines of religion, even though she would describe herself as an atheist, nevertheless she found mystical experiences and the path to compassion. She found this embedded in religion despite being an atheist, and I think she would be correctly classified as a theological cognitivist. Again, somebody who believes that there's something that we're talking about when we're talking about God. So that's the first distinction I want to make. And then now let's move on to the second. This second one is the difference between theism and supernaturalism. So I'm going to go back here to my own story for a second, just to kind of hopefully bring some clarity around this concept. So after I left the faith, I had this view that, yeah, you know, it turns out I think that people who are experiencing God, and when they're describing experiencing God, are really talking about something worth talking about and something that is actually real, whether or not I know the cause of it. And so I had to come up with this distinction. So I'd left the faith, and I described myself as an atheist. I didn't believe in God anymore. But the more that I learned about atheism and the more that I refined my own position, what I found was actually that whether or not I'm a theist or an atheist, I know for sure that I can't find a good reason to believe in the supernatural. Or more specifically, I can't find a good reason to think that the class of explanations which are supernatural hold. And that's really all that my atheism boiled down to. And so that's saying a lot. It is saying I would reject things like any kind of certitude or probability beyond a very low probability that, say, Jesus physically rose from the dead. I certainly couldn't go there anymore because that constitutes a supernatural explanation. So when we're thinking about explanations in general, mostly what we're concerned with is consider a particular phenomena. So let's say, yeah, whatever, the virgin birth. And okay, so that phenomena is a positive phenomenon anyway. And then if that thing were to be true, how could we explain it? And then there's different ways that we could explain our record of the virgin birth. Of course, we don't actually have evidence that there was a virgin birth. We just, well, we have evidence people thought there was a virgin birth, right? And so how could we explain that evidence? So one way to explain that evidence is, well, we should appeal to a supernatural cause here, because typically it proceeds along these lines, because we've eliminated a bunch of other causes. So in the virgin birth, well, it couldn't possibly be that somebody lied about this because, you know, reasons A, B, or C. Or on the virgin birth, I'm trying to think of another reason somebody might reject a natural explanation. Of course, it just turns out that women don't bear children without having been inseminated by a man. And so it couldn't have been a man. We know that because, you know, whatever. There were people around Mary who saw that Joseph wasn't around her or something. You know, I don't know what the story is. But the point here is that a supernatural explanation is often posited in the absence of natural explanation. So you saw this, for example, in the Matt Dillahunty, Jordan Peterson debate. At one point, I can't remember what they were discussing. Peterson said, it probably would have been consciousness, I think. And Peterson said, yeah, so basically, how do you explain that? Because there does seem to be a dearth of natural causes. We just can't find any natural causes here. So wouldn't you want to make an appeal to the supernatural, is the implication. And Matt Dillahunty very carefully and I would say correctly stopped the conversation and said, okay, but just because we don't have a natural explanation doesn't mean, on the other hand, that it's a good reason to buy a supernatural explanation. And so that's the supernaturalism really is that idea. When I say supernaturalism, I mean specifically in the context of explaining things. So then let's contrast that with theism. So obviously there's a very strong overlap between theism and supernaturalism. I would say most people, most humans who have ever believed in a God certainly believed that that God was a supernatural entity. Or we could be more precise and say, certainly believed the explanation for the things that God did involved the supernatural, a non-natural cause. So perfectly willing to concede for most of the time in human history, most people believed and still do believe that you can't have one without the other. Or I should say, well, at least you can't have theism without supernaturalism. That belief is certainly embedded in more fundamentalist figures. I think Paul Vanderklee would probably fall into this category. We'll see in a conversation we're going to have later. But I think figures maybe like Jordan Peterson or even Jonathan Pageau, maybe they wouldn't actually fall into that category. And maybe they would be willing to say one can believe in a God, but not in a supernatural explanation for that God. So how might that work? I'm going to spitball here and just kind of put together on the fly a kind of theism that I think Jordan Peterson might be interested in believing in. that isn't supernatural. So there's all kinds of theisms, of course. There's monotheism, there's polytheism, there's pantheism. But let's just imagine a different type of theism here. Let's call it psychotheism, by which I mean, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, psycho, I just mean psychological. So this would be the idea that God is what Alan Watts called an inner God, a kind of a Hindu God, something that's sort of the highest self kind of embedded within your consciousness, but is not available all the time to your consciousness. So it is kind of in a way buried in the subconscious. So yeah, to put a little icing on that, we can imagine this kind of God being available when we're at certain peak experiences where we really dive deep into our subconscious, whether through psychedelics or meditation or sport or music, and that we kind of tap down into, I think the Quakers called it the inner light. And we tap down into this subconscious, really what that means is we bring up from underneath the consciousness into consciousness this psychological entity, and that psychological entity is what people meant or referred to when they were talking about God, even at least in terms of the content of the experience, the phenomenology of the experience, even if they were wrong about the provenance of that experience, whether or not it was supernatural. So maybe Jordan Peterson might believe in a God like that. Well, we could call that psychotheology or psychotheism, but that could be distinguished from a supernatural outlook. And I think this is such an important point, because many of the atheists that I see in these conversations, so like Matt Dillahunty, for example, he said to Jordan Peterson, "What do you think we lose when we lose God?" And that term God is so fraught that it immediately sends Jordan Peterson, raises his hackles and sends him on this tear about how God is whatever. I think he said the metaphorical substrate of human existence, and so to lose God is basically to lose, everything, more or less. And I think it was just a bad question to ask Peterson. I think the better question to have asked Peterson there would have been simply, what do we lose when we lose the supernatural? And the answer to that question, to my mind, is going to produce a much different result. And so if we could pin Peterson down on this, I'd love to know his answer, because I suspect that, at maybe more than a moment's reflection, but upon reflection, Peterson would probably adopt the idea that in his conception of God, we don't lose much when we lose the supernatural, as opposed to, say, a Paul Vanderklay type of figure who I assume is going to say, no, we lose almost everything if we lose the supernatural. And I think, as we're looking to move this intellectual dark web conversation forward around religion, what I hope that the position that gains traction, what I want is for that position to be, the Enlightenment disabused us of the supernatural, but nevertheless, we did wrong to adopt the notion of theological non-cognitivism, to think there wasn't anything worth reclaiming in religion, and to come to a synthesis which kind of runs against what I might call the house of cards theory. So the House of Cards theory is the notion that religion is sort of built like a house of cards. And right at the bottom, amongst other foundational pieces, is the idea that the supernatural exists. And on the House of Cards view, you flick out that supernatural belief, and boom, the whole pyramid comes crashing down, the entire structure. And I think that's just the wrong view. I think that I think we do lose something when we lose the supernatural, but we don't lose as much as we think we lose. What do we lose when we lose the supernatural? Well, I think we certainly lose, the notion of a personal God that intervenes in human affairs in favor of the confessor. I think that was almost an exact quote from Hitchens. Hitchens is one of my old heroes. But we certainly lose that notion. And, maybe some people would think it would be bad to lose that. I myself, I don't think it's bad. I think that when people conceive of the world in a way that makes use of the supernatural as an actual cause for things, that they don't think well, that their thinking does not correspond to reality. And it creates unforced errors, or unforced problems, should we say. I'll give you an example. I went to Oral Roberts University, and Oral Roberts University is a Pentecostal, it's in the Pentecostal tradition, and most certainly it's in the tradition of faith healing. And so I've had friends who have been ill, physically ill, and have blamed their illness on a supernatural cause, namely, whatever. They haven't believed hard enough, or they didn't pray well enough or something, and God hasn't healed them. And so maybe they didn't blame their sickness on a supernatural cause, but certainly they're not being healed on a supernatural cause. And so they direct much of their effort to praying to a God to get healing. And of course, this is just wildly, I was going to say cruel. It's cruel to ask someone to spend time, to spend effort, to spend energy on a method of dealing with their own sickness that is just entirely ineffectual. And I just can't for the life of me find the good in that. And I think, to be honest, that's part of my fear with this reanimation of religion through Peterson is I don't want that to come back. Like, gosh, please, can we not have people wasting their time, their energy, even their money, and their emotional energy on this category of things that unfortunately just doesn't exist. And I'll leave that there. So we've covered two distinctions: theological non-cognitivism and theological cognitivism. And then that's the first distinction. The second second distinction: theism versus supernaturalism. The idea that those possibly do not have to be identical; that they could overlap maybe, but not be identical. So the third thing I want to bring up is this continuum of dualism, these different types of dualisms. So in broad terms, if we're thinking in broad strokes, if we're thinking about dualism, what we're thinking about is the notion that there seem to be different kinds of things in the world. So there is a world of material, physical causes, and it looks like in that world, for any particular event, we can look back and we can see its antecedent causes, and that cause is itself an event with another antecedent cause, and so on. And that world is different from, on a dualist view, a different kind of world, which is the world of mind. And the world of mind, or soul, we might say, is something that seems to be free from these antecedent causes in an important way, and that interacts with somehow the physical world, but isn't the same as the physical world. That is what dualism is about, broadly speaking. And there's a range of dualisms here. And I think we're missing, in the conversation right now, we're missing some clarity around exactly where people fall in this range. So the very far end of the range, or far end of one of the ends of the range, is substance dualism. And that is the idea that those different kinds of things, the mind stuff and the soul stuff and the material stuff, on the other hand, that they're actually different substances, that it would be inappropriate to say the mind stuff or the soul stuff inheres in the physical universe, that actually through whatever way it exists separately from or outside of the physical universe. That's substance dualism. Now I'm going to contrast that now with property dualism. Property dualism is the idea that the mind stuff and the soul stuff are genuinely different kinds of things than the physical stuff, but that the mind stuff and the soul stuff still exist in this physical world. It's just that the properties of mind stuff are different than the physical stuff. And these kinds of views typically make use of things, or language, I should say, like different properties supervene on the physical world, or different properties emerge from the physical world. So I should have probably said mind stuff supervenes on or emerges from the physical world. This is the view of property dualism. So on this view, I think maybe a good example of this might be, let's say, a computer. So I have a background in programming, and I could create you a chatbot. And you could have a conversation with this chatbot. And if I create a chatbot that's sufficiently complex and I'm really good at it, you might actually for a minute think you were talking to a real human being. Now, I don't mean to open up a conversation about consciousness and personhood and artificial intelligence and everything that goes into that. Let's bracket that question. I realize I've waded into it. But what I'm trying to show with the chatbot example is when we're interacting with the chatbot, there seems to be some personality there. And that personality, however artificial and however incompetent and however shallow, if we were to be very generous and imagine an example in which I've created a chatbot that genuinely has personality, which, by the way, is the view of the substance dualist, or of the property dualist, I should say, what you would end up with is a computer, which is a complex of basically transistors running a personality. So then one question you could ask is, all right, with this personality, exist if the computer didn't exist? If you took the computer away, would the computer exist, or would the personality exist? And the answer on a property dualist view is, of course not. Without the computer, you wouldn't have a personality. But then the property dualist would also be able to say, nevertheless, in this example of a chatbot that I can't build because I couldn't do it sufficiently complex, but on this example, the property dualist would be able to say, yeah, even though this personality runs on this computer, nevertheless, there's certain properties of this personality that are genuinely different than the transistors beneath it, and that these properties of personality supervene on or emerge from the physical components of this computer. So that's property dualism. Let me compare and contrast that with the final kind of dualism, which is on the opposite pole, and this is predicate dualism. And predicate dualism says, you know, when we're talking about mind stuff or soul stuff, the most appropriate language to use is dualistic. But nevertheless, what's going on, all that mind stuff and soul stuff, still inheres in the physical world. It's just, it's very useful. It's almost a pragmatic position. It's very useful to speak of mind stuff and soul stuff on a different language game than that of physics. So I'll give you an example. If you think of, well, I'll give you an example from my own past. The notion of dying to self. This is a Christian notion. It has parallels with Christ dying on the cross. And for me, what it meant as a Christian was a total self-sacrifice to God's project, shall we say. And on a predicate dualist approach, I think I could still have a conversation, even though I'm a monist, even though I'm not a substance dualist. I can still have a conversation with one of my old Christian friends. And if that Christian friend said, yeah, I'm having trouble dying to myself with this issue, or I have just decided that I'm going to die to myself, I can understand them. And furthermore, I think that language, dying to self, is one of the quickest ways to get to a very complex concept, which is basically like ego death. And as such, because it's so effective and quick at getting at that, then I think it's valuable. And so I would certainly count myself to be a predicate dualist. Whether or not I'm a property dualist, I'm not sure. But I'm certainly not a substance dualist. So let me go through these three different things again here. And I'm going to try and pin down a few different figures in the IDW conversation, and I'm going to guess at where they might land on these things. And then I hope as the conversation goes forward, maybe we'll actually get to pin people down on these questions, or at least we'll have these mental models available to us when we're having the conversation. So number one, theological non-cognitivism. Again, this is the idea that talk of God is talk of nothing. Now, I think actually in the intellectual dark web so far, almost no one adopts this position. Again, I think this is the kind of the Richard Dawkins of the world, who just haven't had those spiritual experiences that some of us have had. So I think just about everybody in the intellectual dark web would be a theological cognitivist. Certainly Paul Vanderklay, certainly Jordan Peterson, certainly, absolutely Sam Harris. I mean, Sam Harris, despite being a materialist, is nevertheless, frankly, he's done psychedelics. I don't think once you do psychedelics, it's possible to be a theological non-cognitivist. I think once you go to that place phenomenologically, it's pretty apparent there's something going on when people are talking about God. But I do think that the intellectual dark web, by being theologically cognitivist, is different than the wider culture, at least amongst the intellectual elites. And that's part of what sets it apart and part of what really, I think, makes it interesting. So that's the first one. The second one, theism versus supernaturalism. So again, quick rehash, this is the idea that God is the supernatural. That's one view. But there's also a possibility that you can pull those apart so that God can exist even if the supernatural isn't the best explanation for God's existence. So let's try and pin down a few figures here. Paul Vanderklay. Well, I would say certainly Paul Vanderklay is a theist, and he is also a supernaturalist. So he would be of the view that without he would be of the House of Cards view, that without supernaturalism, theism fails. Jordan Peterson. Well, this is interesting. I think Jordan Peterson, hopefully with some reflection, would agree that he is a theist, but not a supernaturalist. He sees that God exists in some way, but at the same time, the explanation for that God does not have to be supernatural. And then if we were to think of Sam Harris, certainly Sam Harris is not a supernaturalist, he's a naturalist, and I don't think Sam Harris is a theist at all. I think Sam Harris is, generally speaking, an atheist in every sense of the word. And then finally, the different dualisms. So on the one hand, we have substance dualism. I think that like a Paul Vanderklay is going to be a substance dualist. Or also like a William Lane Craig, substance dualist. They believe mind stuff and soul stuff are different things than the physical world. Okay, so that's one end of the spectrum. Now let's look at the middle part of the spectrum, property dualism. I think Jordan Peterson may be a property dualist. He may actually think there are some properties of the phenomenological experience of God which can only be called fundamentally different than the properties of the material world. But he may not have to go as far as saying there's actually different kinds of things in the world, which would be substance dualism. So I think Jordan Peterson would be a property dualist. And then finally, we have predicate dualism. I'm not sure who would adopt this position. Well, myself, I would be a predicate dualist for sure. I may be a property dualist. I'm not convinced yet, but a predicate dualist, absolutely. It is not perfectly appropriate. It's actually most useful, in my view, to describe certain things about being human with the language of God, or with the language of theology. So those are the three distinctions, or the three ideas I want to throw on the table. I'd love to get everybody's comments below, and I'd love to see this start floating in the water more as we're having conversations, because I hope that we can be more precise, and with a little clarity, I think we can move the conversation forward. So thanks so much, everybody. Cheers.